because I'm looking around the house. So I have my own personal evidence when I can feel myself in some state of resistance, my thoughts are in the way. And when I calm my mind, I function differently. I can recall, if we're just talking about memory, I can recall.
Yeah. Also just talking about memory in regards to this practice, because what we talk about in hydrostacy, so the practice has 4 main layers. I call them layers because you don't level up. It's not that type of system where you can forget about 1 and 2 because you've arrived at 3 and 4. That doesn't make any sense. So the level or the layer of hydrostacy simply is you're working with another set of techniques. And those set of techniques are based on something a little bit different than what we've been basing our practice on before. But also not, because we're still using what we've based it on before as well. That's still a part of our tools and a part of our techniques and a part of our practices. So for example, the 4 directions of attention contains everything we've done in the first 3 phases, or the first 3 layers of the system, which is basic mindfulness, counterbalance, warrior training, and hydrostacy. T, as we call it, are those 2 middle ones, if that makes sense. So what I refer to as transcendental embodiment approach would be, because it uses the word embodiment, is the second 2 layers, counterbalance and warrior training. But something starts to change a little bit in hydrostacy because it's feeling based. Of course, I'm not a big fan of using words without clear definition. So really, when I say feeling in this regard, I'm talking about our overall state of being. Everything that you've arrived with in this moment is a part of your current state of being. Everything that we would say is the self, ego, your thoughts, your likes, your dislikes, your memories, your hopes, your aspirations, even things that have been transmitted through your DNA. I think anybody who's worked in a hospital with delivering babies, or interacts with small children, will agree that they don't all come out of the womb with a blank slate. Now, some people will say because they start learning at a certain point inside of the womb, like they're learning from sounds and whatever, but there's also a good chance that we're transmitting things through a form of memory to children, and they come out a little bit different. One comes out, like puppies. One puppy's a little bit moody, and one puppy is a little bit more playful and relaxed, or that's the third one. The third one's relaxed. They all have husky tendencies, because they're husky puppies in this example, but they have slightly different personalities. So we can account for that as well. So without going into where all that comes from, because I don't know, we need more studies to say where those types of things could potentially be coming from. The point is that they're there, and that's what we're arriving with. So you've arrived with all of that, but you're also arriving with the physical body, the mind, and anything unseen. I don't talk too much about anything unseen outside of feeling. How does it feel? And when I say feel, I'm talking about a type of recognition of things that are occurring in your body, in the unseen parts of the body potentially, but definitely in the physical body for sure. And I usually refer to it as electrochemical, physiological, and hormonal response to stimuli. That stimuli could be existing, you're alive, so these things are occurring. Does that make sense? So I'm talking about feeling, kind of giving a good definition of, because that's the whole practice of hydrostacy is based on being able to sense into how you feel and watch that and be cognizant and present moment awareness of your emotional soup, if you will. I don't really agree with using emotions with a single word. I am angry. Whenever you're in an emotional state, just really, if you ever get the opportunity to create space to view your own emotional state, it's a soup of things. Somebody who maybe they win a big contest, They have a wide variety of emotions occurring. They just won the contest, but maybe they're also kind of reflecting on the journey, plus all the literal excitement of the moment, and maybe what this means for their team in the future. All of that is occurring at once because there's a lot of thoughts occurring at once. There's a lot of stimuli outside of the body occurring at once.
There's a lot of chemicals that just are dumped in your system.
Exactly. So that's the soup that I'm talking about. Very rarely, if ever, have we ever just been an anger soup or a happy soup or a this soup. Nobody has soup. That's just water. That's just broth. Even broth has multiple components. So yeah, we don't arrive as just this clear, colorless, odorless, flavorless water. We're a soup of a wide variety of things occurring in any one moment.
And our brain is interpreting what that is.
It is, and it's not. We have above and below recognition. So there are things that are hopefully above recognition. Some people are not above recognition with how they feel at all. They're just feeling it. They're just expressing it because their majority of their psychology in that moment is falling below the level of active recognition.
But the brain is still interpreting the feeling.
It is, yeah. So
that
above and below.
Excitement, what it means is interpreted by the brain, but your brain is still interpreting what adrenaline feels like.
Sure. So and I kind of began with anything that you're feeling is a version of your brain's interpretation of experience, right? Or of the chemical cocktail that you're creating, right? So if you feel anything, then you're especially if it's above the level of recognition, because you can feel it below the level of recognition, but you don't know. Like you'd have to stop and, okay, now what am I feeling? And maybe you even need someone's help to kind of talk out, like, what are we feeling? That's how therapists and psychologists can be helpful to some extent, because they can help us understand where are we in this emotional soup. Because some people, they don't know. They're not used to paying attention to themselves or the moment to any degree, which is not that rare. You'd be surprised. Or you wouldn't, I don't know. Okay, so the second set of techniques are techniques. They're things that we do. And what we're doing a lot of the time in these separate, and nobody has to do this. I'm not saying that anybody ever has to participate in the fourth layer of the Bridge Mindful, any layer of the Bridge Mind. You can just come here and listen, I don't care. But if you are interested in that layer, one of the things that we begin to work with is something that I call emotional memory. And that would be essentially what I mean by the fourth technique of remembering. We're remembering something that we have felt before to some extent. Again, you're arriving completely unique. So there's going to be a tint of uniqueness there as well. There's nothing we can do about that, because, or I don't know why you would want to anyway, but so the memory is also carrying characteristics of the present moment, if that makes sense. And the memory is electrochemical, physiological, hormonal. You're getting that similar feeling to whatever it is that you're recalling. And if it's hydrostacy, you're doing this from a place of space and peace. Some people are like, well, what if I recall bad memories? That's not how this works, because you're coming from a place of peace. You're not coming from a place of below the level of recognition where you're not actively choosing how you want to feel, which is why I write them down so I can remember, oh yeah, just like in the beginning when I want to remember to pay attention to a particular object. Keep in mind I'm still doing that. Now, I can't emphasize enough, if I'm talking about hydrostacy, I'm implying that there's something very active in the first section of my practice. For me, it's the 4 directions of attention. So if I'm talking about hydrostacy, please just assume that I'm engaging my 4 directions of attention as well. Does that make sense? Now, for me, it's 4 directions of attention. For you, it could end up being who knows what, whatever. It could be the 4 directions if you find that fancy and to your fancy, and you're interested and you want to do that, you can do that. But the practices and the tools, they can be wildly unique to the individual, just like the feelings are. So I'm not trying to sell you a feeling or say, Karen, you can feel this magnificent feeling that I feel. Like, I don't know, it's going to be different. I can give some ideas on how to do things, maybe. The timeless nature of infinity. I get that feeling the more that I focus on detail without judgment. And keep in mind, I'm already practicing, so I'm not bored or at odds with the present moment. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing anything hydrostacy in the first place. So I'm not bored, I'm not at odds, there's space, I'm operating from peace and happiness because I'm content. That's what it means when you're not bored, you're content. And you can still create, you can still do amazing things with a sense of contentment simultaneously. Again, it's a soup. So some people say, well, if you're content, then you get stuck. That's not necessarily the case. That might be something just a little bit different. All this makes sense so far? So that's kind of what we started talking about in the beginning, is emotional memory. But there's another pillar and another technique. So one of the techniques that I'm doing most often throughout the day is remembering a particular feeling that I desire. I find it desirable, and I'm not changing. So if I wake up and I don't feel, my best, I just don't feel my best. I'm not trying to change anything, but I am going to go back into my power and start determining the direction of my attention and how I want to feel, because I would be doing that anyway, right? If I'm doing my practice, I would be doing that anyway. So I'm not going to do anything really any different. I'm not trying, but there's no expectation. That's kind of a karma yoga talk. It's kind of a different talk, but I'm not carrying any expectation. So I'm not trying to change an emotion from sadness to anything else. It'll change on its own, and probably in a little bit, I'm going to feel the contentment again because I'm paying attention to it. I'm highlighting it. It's always there. People say that all the time, that this stuff is always there. It's never away from us. Okay, well, put your attention on it, and that makes it active. That makes it a part of your present moment. So I have a wide variety of electrochemical, physiological, hormonal states of being that I find particularly desirable. And my practice, because I'm in this hydrostacy practice, is remembering. Just like I would have to remember to bring myself back to the present moment, sometimes I have to remember to bring myself back to how I want to feel. Otherwise, I'm a leaf at the mercy of the wind. I'm going to end up feeling like, very likely it will be conditioned by my circumstances and surroundings, and just like anything else, what I'm responding to in the moment. Maybe there's a lot of noise, or maybe there's not a lot of noise and things are very relaxing, and now I feel peace because things are relaxing, or I feel anxious because things are moving really quickly and I can't predict any of it. You see, so that's kind of leaf at the mercy of the wind. I don't want to be that. I want to arrive in this moment exactly how I choose. Does that make sense? And that describes the fourth pillar of deliberate modulation, choosing how you want to feel. And if you're choosing how you want to feel, that must imply, I wish Gene was here because he has the devil's advocate voice very sharply as well. If you're choosing, that means that you're remembering, like you have to have felt it before. If you're choosing from a toolbox of, it can't be something you've never felt before, it wouldn't be in your toolbox. Nobody here can think about a subject they don't know anything about. So if astronomy is a subject you know nothing about, you can't sit here and think details of astronomy because you don't have any of that information in your brain. You can't think something you don't know. But of course, the brain is really good at organizing, compartmentalizing, putting things in particular places so that it's more accessible, so that it's more understandable, and that we can communicate it better to other people. So I'm not throwing these things that the mind can do out and saying don't do it. I'm just saying balance is the principle. All that makes sense? So that describes the fourth pillar, kind of, and the reason we went into that is because Donna was talking about, we talked a little bit about memory, and that's really one of the ways that memory really starts to fit into the system. And it's not going to be something you hear a lot about in the world, because there are probably very few people who, A, have created the space necessary to choose, B, have chosen, and C, have maintained emphasis enough or to the degree that they can talk about it or yield any results that they could share. Does that make sense? So my hypothesis, that hopefully you all can help me usher into theory, or not, it's fine too, somebody will end up doing it, I'm sure, is that when you clear the mind and you create a peaceful state of being, that you can actually begin to choose exactly how you want to feel. We didn't grow up hearing this. Nobody ever told us that, Ernest, you can actually determine every day for the rest of your life exactly how you want to feel. I would have been like, what are you talking about? That doesn't, no, I'm a condition of my environment or my psychology. That's definitely playing a part. So I'm not eliminating that in the chemistry cocktail and in the soup. However, from a state of peace and a state of relaxation and what I call contentment / happiness, we can choose. And that's what we do with the peace that we've created, is now our lens of perception is clear. We're not operating off of old conditioning and habit and old desires that don't really look at a lot of your desires. Where did they come from? Where did these desires just land in your field of awareness? A lot of them come from the destroyers. They come from biological factors. They come from habits that we've created already that create new habits, that create new habits. They've come from society. What are the other ones? What's the other destroyer? Yeah, I forget them sometimes. All that makes sense?
It makes sense. And you are always doing the foundational work,
Yes.
even when you're in hydrostacy,
Mhm.
because you your mind is quiet and you're utilizing some tools, and then you can experience some emotion, an emotional feeling, or a memory, an emotional memory,
Mhm.
or you have a feeling and it evokes a memory, like I said with the orange peel smell.
Sure.
And then if that's a pleasurable, desirable thing, and or it's so tangible that you choose it as a technique now. I want the orange peel feeling. And so now I recognize that I have had brushes with that feeling before, and an associated stimuli was a smell. So I can choose to recall that, to place my attention there, to emphasize that feeling. And that's what, having the orange peel feeling all day, or contentment, or whatever you want to choose all day feels like. I gotta get that.
That's your first call. But yes, that's exactly right. So um, I think what Donna said is, I have to have the practice in place, the points of attention in place in order to find myself doing the hydrostacy practice. So you can't have one without the other, if that makes sense. Any questions about that? That's pretty, Ida, any questions about deliberate modulation? It's been a part of this practice since almost day one, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Now, I want to tell you something funny that just happened to me this morning.
Mhm.
I was on my way down to the store at 20 minutes before class, let's just say. So I thought I'll be home in time for class. Went into the store, went through the self-checkout, and came out with my groceries and didn't pay. And this is the first time ever I didn't do that. There's a checkout beside me, and all the things are binging and going, "Thank you, please take your items." And I must have heard that, lifted my bag, took the trolley, and went out. And I got home, or halfway home, my spidey senses started to go and think, my purse wasn't at the top of the bag, and it's always at the top of the bag because the card's in the purse, blah, blah, blah. Got home, purse was at the bottom of the bag, had to drive the whole way back to the store, go in, and the guy helped me all out with it. Now, on the way into the store, I was thinking lime green was the color that I was going to choose for going around the store, my point of attention and my feet on the floor. Where did that go? I don't know. I come out without paying for the first time ever and had to go back to the store. That's why I was late for class.
Yeah.
So there you are. I obviously wasn't practicing or practicing sporadically on the way into the store, but then thoughts of what I needed to get had
Mhm.
come in, and I'd lost all all my points and come out without paying. So
There you go.
there
Yeah.
you go.
It'll happen just like I filled the cup up with hot water. But the trick is that, the more you're practicing, the sooner you see these things. And maybe one day we'll live in a world where there's no silly accidents because we're all paying attention. I wonder how many times these accidents are just distraction. It's just sheer distraction. So we find ourselves in really weird situations because we weren't paying attention. In Edith's case, it was, I almost said grand theft, but I doubt grand theft, just theft. Shane,
About
Edith pilfered.
$20. And the girl in the store who I know quite well because I'm in most days, she says I do it all the time. And we had to walk out this morning, so I was the second one. So I knew which till I was using, so that helped.
Yep, it'll
But
happen.
there you go. Yeah, it's first time for everything.
Yeah, and then we can see how the practice kind of fits into there as well. So Donna was mentioning, I think I mentioned that it's what we're doing and what we're talking about is pretty rare. When we're talking about choosing how you want to feel, the thing that makes all of this stick, it's the difference maker in the system. So Donna talked about brushes of feeling. Does that make sense? We've all had brushes, right? Where for some circumstances or for one reason or another, we find ourselves feeling ... and it's enjoyable. Maybe we find ourselves with a little bit of peace, with a little bit of, whatever it is that we're feeling. That makes sense, right? The brush of spirit.
Yep.
But what are the tools and what are the ways to maintain emphasis on that feeling? That's what I don't think that we were ever, taught, right? So we go on vacation, we find a feeling. What do? We feel it for a little while, we go back to whatever we're doing, and it either comes or it goes. We don't know because we're back to leaf at the mercy of the wind. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, Lauren, before we started doing this practice, how often did we learn to focus on a particular feeling that is enjoyable, to elongate it and emphasize it and maintain emphasis? That's the third pillar, and that's also in some senses that's the sixth pillar, is maintaining emphasis. That's the embodiment factor, and that's what makes this practice really different from other things. Mindfulness-based stress relief will say that when you're feeling stressed, breathe, pay attention to the present moment, say a mantra. Doesn't that sound like foundational mindfulness to you? It's the same thing. It's mindfulness-based stress relief, and folks will use that when they don't feel good. And I think that's great. But maintaining emphasis, that's how you embed it into the very fabric of everything that you do. When you're getting food prepared, you're doing it without judgment, fully engaged. I say fully, but you're more engaged in the task using your deliberate attention. Fully is an erroneous word. Ada, did you see that? I used a word that I don't really, it's not a very definable word, fully. What do we mean fully? What is fully, right? It's a word that is pretty undefinable. But the trick isn't not saying fully. It will be, because that habit eventually will fall out of my vocabulary. But it's about cognitive attention. Attention on your own thoughts as they occur, on your own actions as they occur. And I gave an example right there. I said a word that I didn't really agree with in the context of the sentence, and I strike it from the record and replace it. But that's an example, right? That's just like you at the grocery store. There was a lapse in practice, but then you see it. That makes sense, right? Yep. All right, any questions? I mean, I could go on and on and on about hydrostacy, but I think Donna asked a little bit about dream walking, and I'm just making shit up. That's just a word and a phrase that I use to describe something, something that's not necessarily teachable, but I can still talk about it. I'll wait till she comes back. But what's what's something else that we could talk about? Anything, any aspect of the embodied mindfulness practice? Counterbalance, warrior training, foundational mindfulness principles, anything. Shayna, anything? Lisa, you could type it, anything? Anything that anybody needs to hear or talk about? You can see that I'm interacting with the hydrostacy practice much like I interacted with other aspects of the practice. I have objects that remind me of certain feelings, emotions, soups. I have a note card. I have mantras that redirect me. I use my rule of 3 to redirect back to these feelings, just like I used to redirect back to the present moment. If I start to notice my 4 directions are losing, a direction or 2, I can forget about hydrostacy and I just need to go back to my 4 directions of attention and put that back in place. And I do that sometimes using the rule of 3. So that kind of gives you an example. I'm doing the same thing that everybody else is doing with their practice. It's just a little bit different now. Ida, any questions? You can steer the direction. What would you guys like to know? So group study, I mean, I would prefer to meet everybody with their questions and comments and anything that they have going on. Midterm elections for Americans. So, how do you interact with politics? How do you interact with people who disagree or agree? I don't know. I guess there's somebody agreeing with one another out there.
Well, the social sort of feeling around here at the minute, I'm getting it, is like, what way could I describe it? There seems to be like a fear feeling surrounding everything in the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
It's a feeling of the digital world taking over, freedoms being lost, and the woke society is expanding. That's the feeling that's kind of in the air around me.
Yeah.
And obviously that is populated by my own thoughts. I have a brother-in-law who is really quite, don't want to judge him but he doesn't mind that because we can talk about these things, but he's quite off-grid, so should I say, and he can, the conspiracy theories can be a bit much and he can go into that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
When he talks like that, it makes me realize how balanced I feel I am in all of it. But there is a feeling in society, I'm feeling this all around, of this fear of loss of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We
all kinds of freedoms, like for example, my husband wanted to buy something on eBay the other day, and he doesn't smoke anymore, but he vapes, so it was part of a vape thing, and they were actually asking for his age verification.
Mm-hmm.
So the age verification, and he's been on eBay for over 20 years, so they could have just checked back on that, but they wanted an actual photograph of him or a video to identify his age. So he wanted to cancel the transaction, and then they told him that he couldn't cancel the transaction. It was just a whole circle of nonsense around this age verification. So there's more freedoms he felt being lost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
I do know what you mean. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a relatable subject matter, I suppose. Isn't politics all first ring anyway? Well, I guess that's a good question, Santina. If we put it in terms of the rings of power, remember that the first ring eventually can be a ring of power. It just doesn't start that way because there's no balance. So the first ring is typically a trap. And if we're thinking about politics, the reason for politics in the first place, frankly, is a result of a wide variety of things, and none of them that we're talking about or learning in group. But the fact is that we have to interact with these things, so in the mindfulness practice, we're not denying that politics exists. We're not denying that the momentum of politics exists. So Ida and I aren't going to talk about whether, opinions, that's not really what we would talk about. But what we could talk about is, well, what do we do? How does our practice apply? Where does the practice come in when people are talking about politics or the climate around us feels politically charged, right? Santina, isn't that just acknowledging what is actually around us? I mean, we're in a midterm election in Illinois, and every commercial, we're getting things in the mail. Like it has come to my attention. It's been, sent to me in the mail. I see it when I look online. There's all these little ads and they're political attacks. So I'm in that soup. I'm not off the grid like, yeah, same in Michigan. Well, where does the mindfulness practice come in, right? So how do we apply principle? What would you say, Ida? So in some of those situations, how are you applying your practice?
Well, I would every morning when I wake up, then I would not allow those thoughts to change the direction of any thoughts that come in that say that the world is becoming such and such a place, and to remember through my own feelings, through my own experience, by using mantras and by staying in the moment and using the tricks to stay in the moment, to be able to see the birds in the trees and things moving and colors and the things that enhance my life, rather than fear thoughts that shut it all down and bring me back to some kind of a feeling that the world is a bad place.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't feel like that the world is a bad place and that everybody is bad and everybody's out to get you. But there is a feeling, not a feeling, but when you listen to too much media or listen to opinions, that can affect your own well-being. If you allow it to. You have to, stay true to yourself, to the principles, to your tricks, and to everything that we have learned to keep us in that middle space in the equalizer bar on the music system. That's what I always call it, the equalizer. Not too much bass, not too much treble, but somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle.
And then you can view it all as a drama and a play around you can look at it with humor rather than cynicism. So that's how I operate.
I would say that's the practice is in place, without too much judgment. I like that you say, Lauren, without too much, because we're going to judge certain things. We have opinions. You have arrived as an opinionated human being. It's just weird how people talk sometimes, isn't it? No judgment. You're in a no judgment zone. Oh, bullshit. Don't even tell me that. You're going to judge and you're going to have opinions. The key is, how much do we entertain that? What do we do with it once we see it? I choose to reflect personally on my own behavior when I see something, when my mind judges. If I see Donna throwing trash on the ground, I'm going to think, well, what the fuck? That's shitty, Donna. But rather than think about that for the next 45 minutes, I'm just going to reflect on my own behavior, probably pick it up for her and make sure that she sees me picking it up. Maybe not. But yeah, so without too much judgment is the key. But this also, the way that we approach things, we allow for our own opinion, otherwise we're just talking shit. We're hustling ourselves. If we say that we have no judgment of other people. No, you do. Your mind does it. It's a safety mechanism. It's called unconscious bias. Like, that exists. Our mind creates that as a mechanism of safety. Is it right? Is it wrong? It doesn't matter. It's what the brain physically does in order to help keep us safe. So
We can put it in a different, we can lessen it. We can put it in a different priority. I know I have this judgment, but I'm going to move it down over here
Exactly.
while I have this. Yeah,
Yep.
the treble, the bass is a good analogy.
Yep. And Santina, usually when you really believe something and know it yourself, we don't feel the need to convince anyone of anything. So typically, if we are arguing, we're not fully convinced ourselves, or we don't really know what we're talking about. We're just repeating something that we heard or read recent. How many times are you talking to someone and it sounds like you're talking to the YouTube video that they just watched, or the book that they just, okay, it's not usually a book they just read, an article that they just skimmed over. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm almost positive that Ida isn't intending to do is she's starting to touch on a way that I've learned to organize things. I organize them so that I don't, because I can see the mechanics. So Ida's getting into something that I call seeing. Seeing is a phrase that I have borrowed from Don Juan, but I don't talk about it the way that he does. I don't talk about it the way that Carlos Castaneda does. The way that I talk about seeing has to do with sensory perception, creating space, peace, and being able to see things from multiple perspectives, even multiple perspectives simultaneously. But I don't want to get too much into that, Ida, but that should sound a little bit familiar with what you just said to a certain extent. But what Ida's really starting to touch on is what I call the fifth destroyer. And there's something that fuels the fifth destroyer, and it's one of the last things that I would want to talk about in anything, is because it's the source. It's one of the sources of a wide variety of examples of suffering, and it comes from a mind being at odds with the present moment. And it's mostly a psychological thing, although when it expresses itself as a physical thing, it can be useful. But it's fear. And Ida, everything that you just mentioned is, and you use the word several times, is the society factor. And the society factor is coming from the individual factor, of course. They're feeding each other. You know how it's not this mysterious they that is controlling the minds of, no, it's a snake eating its tail. It's feeding itself. It's a closed feedback loop. The entertainment industry gives what they think they can profit from, and they think they can profit from the things that they think that people will watch, such as drama. People love drama. TV shows are drama, movies are drama. I don't know how many movies that I've seen that get popular that don't have hundreds of body counts, where it's just drama, 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 drama. What is the news going to look like? It's not going to be all happy, no drama, because nobody wants to watch that. So they're going to show you the drama that the mind wants to see. And it's all fear driven. It's all fear based. The mind is afraid of what it doesn't know, or what it doesn't understand, or what it can't categorize, or what it can't potentially predict. And so it comes up with all of these different scenarios. And Ida, you could notice that all of these different scenarios are removing the person from the present moment, going into internal thought patterns and thinking about it. And now you're in psychological time, concerned about a potential, and then before you know it, we're violating all of the warrior training traps of thinking because we've gone into who knows what. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that the vast majority of things that we're dealing with as a society, and it's one of the things that feeds the fifth destroyer, and of course it comes from the nemesis, a mind below the level of recognition, but it's highly fear driven, and it's a psychological fear. It's disproportionate to the circumstances. There's nothing really occurring, and I have developed ways to interact with these things. And they involve feeling, they involve using things like inner guru, like imagining inner guru to a certain extent. Does that make sense, Ida? Does that seem to connect with some of the things that you were
Yes,
mentioning?
it does.
Yeah.
And you're talking about entertainment, and the movies you mentioned there with body counts and a
And I'm
lot
not
of
saying they're
the.
bad. Yeah.
No, they're not, because
Yeah.
they are very skillfully done, and you can see
Sure.
the creation, right?
Yeah.
But it made me think of movies that are about behavioral change, which is what I love. I love to
They're so
watch a
rare.
movie where somebody's learning something and it happens throughout the movie and then they become.
Hmm.
I love to watch movies that are about becoming something,
That,
something good, obviously, something that has
yeah,
a happy ending.
that
But
likely reflects your personality.
see, there's
Or movie. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, there's different series that have been on, and I did love the Sherlock one, but there was one called
Oh, I love
Whitechapel,
Sherlock.
and it was so gory. It was about London in the well, it was about the Jack the Ripper sort of series,
Mm,
and I could not watch any more of it. You know, I liked the characters in it, but I couldn't watch any more of it because it
hmm.
was like a. So obviously, whoever is directing that is getting that feeling of the grime of um, the streets of London at a certain time.
Hmm.
But to watch something that is not about solving a murder is a bit of a relief these days.
Yeah.
To watch something light is,
Hmm.
well, I like that. I like to watch something that is. That's why period dramas, I think, work very well,
Hmm.
because you're seeing how people lived long ago, and then you can look out for antique things and see how true they are to the time, like, you know, oil lamps and street, you know, horse and carts and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
there you go.
makes sense to me. But yeah, so that kind of gets into, in the hydrostacy system at a certain point, there is a point where you can personally start to address fear responses, psychological fear responses that are disproportionate to the circumstances, disproportionate to everything, because it's all just a psychological creation. One of the things I'll just tell you that can really benefit is the principle of adaptation. So, Ida, if that was happening to me and I had to send a picture of I'm going to adapt, I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm not going to attach to ideas of what something should be or what it shouldn't be. And because now we're getting into psychological time and we're trying to control and ultimately it leads back to, because we're afraid of unknowns, we're afraid of things being different than what we expect them to be. So there's two big things that come into play, and one of them is expectation of desired results, expectations of certain things that we expect, expectations of expecting, I guess. That's kind of a double, same thing. But those are two big factors of driving fear. So two of the ways that I address that personally with my hydrostacy practice is yin yoga, or the yogi. And I don't want to talk too much because that will reveal a character in my book. But the yogi is somebody that I talk to, but is the essence of, how do I explain that? It's the essence of just doing for doing. And if you just do for doing, well, what are you afraid of? And then I have it's hard to describe how I anthropomorphize adaptation. It's very dragon-esque. But yeah, that's just me in my mind. I'm not telling you to imagine dragons. Believe me, people would say that that's crazy. So don't do anything that's crazy. But those are two things that I do. And because I experience fear, fear of, maybe people don't like my writing, or, a fear that I'm doing all of that writing for nothing, or a fear that I'll do classes and people won't show up because I don't like advertising. I don't, I'm not a marketing guru. That's not my lane. I don't choose to put energy in it because I just don't like it. So fear, fear, fear. Well, what do I do with that? I feel. What do I feel? Well, first of all, I do my practice, because I have to establish my 4 directions in order to do this anyway. So first I do my 4 directions. And isn't that what we were talking about, Ida? Like we come back to the present moment, we come back to our practice, we interrupt the regular scheduled, broadcast of fear and thought about, what government plan is going to be the best plan and which politician is going to clean up the streets of Chicago. It's like none of you are, it's like you guys are so off base. All of this is just a bunch of shit. It's pandering to intellectual laziness, because if we had this more broad view, we would see that this is all just a bunch of shit. It's the same old shit. Just it's being expressed a little bit differently. So there's two primary ways, and Ida, maybe they'll be useful to you, maybe they won't, but I interact with two feelings, two forces, two essences. One of them is adaptation. Adaptation, I'll always be adapting. I'll be adapting to needing to send in my ID with something. I have to get a real ID soon, which means I need to change my name because they all have to. I'm not going to be like, oh, my freedoms, I'm just going to go do it. Like I'm just going to adapt. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to keep, evolving my mind, because that's what affects the fifth destroyer, not a government program, not, some law or something that it's like, oh my God, this is the law of all laws that will change everything and will clean up the streets of Chicago. No, like this doesn't make sense. Change begins in the heart and the mind and works outwardly from there. And until all of that starts to occur on a more consistent basis, we're not going to gain the momentum necessary to overcome the fear and the fifth destroyer. Or we will, we're in this group right here talking about it, and we have folks joining us and eventually we'll have more folks joining us. So it is what it is. But so the other thing I do, so I'll just tell you the two things. One of them is I embody adaptation, which means I don't have control over everything. It is the way it is, right? Your husband doesn't have control over everything. So he had to send in an ID because they've actually proven that these vape cartridges burn at such a hot level. And young people, they just take these gigantic hits because they're young and they just don't know any better, right? And then they hit it and they hit it and they hit it and it burns the metal. And they're actually getting heavy metals in their lungs that they wouldn't be able to get into their lungs otherwise. We don't get cadmium and nickel into our lungs very easily, and it comes from vape cartridges, specifically nicotine ones, but cannabis ones can do the same thing. Cannabis, some companies are starting to use what's that material? It's a non-metal. It's like an acrylic. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it'll come to me. And that doesn't leach metals into the liquid. So they're limiting, because when you're younger, it can affect you much, much worse long term because your lungs aren't fully developed. So they want to prevent younger people from having access to these things. Like it, love it, hate it, I don't know. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it infringing? Am I a libertarian? I don't really care about any of that. I'm just going to adapt and continue to adapt and continue to vanquish my own fear, dissolve it. I think dissolve is a better word. I like vanquish because I imagine vanquishing. I imagine like there's the door, fear. You can just walk right the fuck out because I don't need you right now. There's no tiger in the room and you're not really benefiting me, so please leave. The other way is
It's more like redirection.
It is redirection.
You can't dissolve it.
Well, no.
You can only redirect from it so that it dissolves.
Exactly. Yeah. So dissolving is something that it happens on its own. I kind of imagine like you drop a tablet in water. You didn't have to do anything. It was just the water causes the tablet to dissolve and then it disperses. That's how I imagine it. So yeah, when I say dissolving, that's not something I'm directly doing. But what I am doing is I'm redirecting to these two different essences, and you can use them if you want to, or ask me more questions, or eventually you'll read about them. And it isn't to the end of my book series that I talk about the fifth destroyer. So you're getting a heck of a flash forward. But two of the things that I do, and it comes out in my next book, I introduce it because fear has, I don't want to say that because that's going to be a spoiler. No, I don't want to spoil my book. The next book is really good. But ultimately, here's two things that I do. These are tools. Like Donna said, you can't not do something. So one of the things that I do is I embrace the spirit, the essence of adaptation. Adaptation isn't trying to control the future. It's not trying to look back on a past to prevent an erroneous future. What am I adapting to right now in this moment? Half the time when we're talking about politics, it is not affecting the room that you're in. Sure, it might be affecting your grocery prices. That's when you're at the grocery store. That's when you're doing your budget and things like that. You may have to adapt again. So that may mean that I don't buy certain things that I'm used to buying because for right now, I have to adapt. Some people are afraid of change. They're afraid of not being able to get exactly what they want when they want it. And that fear drives the fifth destroyer, all the other destroyers, and we find ourselves trying to control a future that doesn't exist based on a past that likely is just a individual perception of the past. It's not as if it's any consensus of events are occurring. So the other thing that I do is I imagine my yogi. And this is different than inner guru. I have a guru and a yogi. Have you ever seen The Matrix when Neo is trapped in between worlds? He's like in a train station and he's talking to the person about love. Do you remember that part? Well, that's the person who every character in my book, I imagine, Inner Guru is played by Anthony Hopkins, by the way. It was between Anthony Hopkins and Christopher Lloyd, but Christopher Lloyd from Back to the Future, because his hair is all over the place. But Anthony Hopkins, he can play any role. So I have Anthony Hopkins right now as Inner Guru. But I have this other person as the yogi. And so the yogi reminds me that it's the expectation, the removal of what you expect or what you think you desire, what you think that you want, what you think that you need. And it's the focus on that expectation. It's the focus on the desire that becomes so imbalanced that we cling to it. We attach to it. And if you notice, it's proportionate. So if you want to know if you're attached to something, remove it from your experience, right? And if you feel terrible, you were attached. Another degree of attachment, even more attachment, is even think about it being removed. And if you feel afraid of that object being removed from your life, you are extremely attached to that stimuli, and that will cause suffering. That's just the equation. It causes suffering. So the yogi reminds me to do my karma yoga. Just write your books. Why? Because you can. Because it's your creative expression. And I also have these things that I call the human element. Again, I don't know if dolphins have humor, but there's certain aspects to the human, and I think they do, you know, whatever, but that's not the point. The point is that there are certain aspects to the human cognition that doesn't seem directly relatable to evolution physically. We don't need to find a sunset beautiful in order to evolve physically. So my hypothesis is that when we got to the top of the food chain, we started to evolve more psychologically than physically because we didn't need to adapt. We changed the environment so that it can adapt to us, basically, such as air conditioning and a fireplace to heat the air. So now we're safe, we have food, we're at the top of the chain. And then our mind started to evolve a little bit more. We found things beautiful, we found things funny. We all of a sudden realize that we could imagine things that aren't there, that we have this imagination mechanism. And it's like, oh, wow, these are great aspects of the human experience. Those are things that I direct my attention towards. I want to emphasize those aspects of psychological evolution so it can continue to change over time, so I can continue to activate it. Does that make sense? That's why I use my imagination so much, because it will go into atrophy if you don't. And that's an aspect that I view as a result, a direct result of the human evolution of mind, psychology, our mind, which is psychology's inside of that. Does that make sense? So the yogi will remind me of my karma yoga, that you're just creating because creating is a human characteristic. You love it, you enjoy it. Go listen to some music. Why? Because you love it. You don't know why you love it. You just came out of the womb, you know, bopping. You like music. It is what it is. It's the human experience. Embrace these aspects. And so my karma yogi will remind me that, number one, all of this is taking me out of the present moment. The yogi stays in the present moment. But then the yogi also reminds me of the burden of expectation, the burden of being attached to things because it makes you less adaptable the more attached that you are to a certain situation. If you're attached to riches, if you're attached to pampering, if you're attached to indoor air conditioning, if those things are removed from you, you will suffer. And the degree of attachment makes you less adaptable. So what we're looking to do is balance all of those things. And so two forces that I use are the karma yogi. He reminds me, it is a he. That particular character of my mind is a male character. Actually, it's a really non-binary character because there's no male or female with yogi. Yogi is just yogi. But then, so yogi reminds me to do my karma yoga. But then I have the essence, which is kind of, it's not human, but I use my imagination, because if I use my imagination, what am I doing? I'm using another aspect of the human element that I want to emphasize. I want to sharpen it. I want it to continue to change. And what else can I do? Maybe someday our imaginations will be the bridge between the unseen, which pretty much every mind of antiquity has pointed towards that the imagination is a bridge between the seen and the unseen, and that we can utilize imagination for creative purposes. Of course, Einstein said that. Abraham Hicks said that. You know, the minds of antiquity have been repeating that over and over. But then what do we do in our society? We grow up. We start paying bills. We start getting reasonable. And by reasonable, that means existing in psychological time and trying to control. And this practice gives up all of that. So the further that we go into hydrostacy, I give recommendations of ways to interact with your own fear response. Why? Because I'm interacting with my own fear response. It comes up. It is what it is. And sometimes it's appropriate. And I'm like, oh, I should lock the doors. I do live in a city that, you know, I need to be aware. I need to be present. When Shayna and I are walking and we're in high activity zones, I just tell her, I don't need to talk right now. I'm in safety mode because there's so much stimuli around me. And we live in a city that a lot of the things that happen bad to people are simply because they're not aware of their environment. They're looking in their cell phones, they're making themselves targets. I don't look like a target. I look like a risk versus reward need to evaluate because this person's highly aware of their environment. Very difficult to sneak up on me when I'm in that mode. Fear is the biggest one, Ida. It's not a big one for you. It's the biggest one for humanity, is psychological fear. You've gotten to the end of this. That's also a part of the end of this system. Psychological fear. And it's not trying to end psychological fear. Again, that's not reasonable, is it? Maybe it is for a different society. They don't have as much psychological fear because they never created it in the first place. But I've conditioned myself for it. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you.
It's okay.
What I do whenever I feel that fear, feeling about anything, is try and imagine how I would feel without fear. And I can sort of feel something on the other side of fear that is the absence of fear, if you know what I mean.
I can dig it. That's not something I
As
do.
long as
But
you're not
yeah,
focusing,
that's great.
whatever technique you use to redirect from the
Yeah.
fear is a great technique. As long as you're not trying to dissolve fear. As long as
Right.
if you're focused on the fear, that's what you'll amplify. So
Right.
looking
Yeah, but I'm
the feeling of
replacing
beyond it or the absence of it
Yeah.
is fine. Even something
Yeah.
completely not fear related is also pretty good. But yeah, whatever
Well,
works.
you are replacing it, really, aren't you?
You're redirecting
replacing the feeling. Yeah, redirecting. A
Mhm.
memory came from years and years ago, and when we started doing this practice, and because over these 5 years, it has evolved for me to look back on times in my life when I put myself through a lot of drama, a lot of pain, because I didn't know these things and I didn't know these techniques, and it's
Right.
taken me till I'm 61 to learn even some of it. I remember the time where I had a relationship with a guy and we lived together, and he left. and I was living on my very own at 31 for the first time in my life, was actually living by myself, and the fear of that, and sitting up at night and reading a little book. It was called God Calling, and it was all quotes and just little prayers and things. And I used to sit and read that during the night, to stop me being afraid and finally fall asleep. And it didn't happen all the time, but sometimes I lifted that little book and I would have read it for several hours until the peace came into me and I was able to go to sleep, because I had to experience living on alone, for the first time in my life. And then I remember the feeling of, so this thing about replacing a feeling, once my own life had started to pick up again, it was about a year after he had gone, and this was just the tail end of it. And I remember this feeling of every weekend, thinking about where he was going to be, and he was with this new girl and how that was affecting me. And then I started to get my own life. I started to expand again and reach out. And I remember this incident, which was the very first incident that I remember thinking, for the first time this weekend, it was such a great relief. I don't care what he's doing, because this is what I'm doing. And my own life. I had met my husband then. He wasn't my husband then, but I had met him then. And I remember thinking, oh, this is such a great relief. I don't have to have this fear of missing out or whatever it was, but to look back over incidences in my life where I created so much pain just by not knowing these things about emotions and love and attachment that should be taught in school, so that people don't have to go through this.
But you
for
kind
most
of
of their
did.
lives.
You kind of did, because you were reading the book to distract your thoughts to better thoughts, or to better feeling thoughts, and just removing, the peace didn't come upon you, just removing your thoughts from the ones that brought about fear.
Yeah. But didn't know
allowed
that at the time.
allowed the peace. So you were doing it, you were doing it out of desperation, kind of. And you didn't necessarily do it all day long, but you were actually practicing. Ernest was talking about memory. That's how we started this class. And every time I have an experience like you just explained, it's probably over a much shorter duration of time now, because I recognize it and I go back to the practice. But it's the same, the principles are still the same. It's just that we've dragged it over a long period of time, and the intensity of attachment is different, and we don't have anything in our toolbox to pick up. So it's an elongated, exaggerated practice, but the principles are all the same. So that practice of you reading that book, and that was redirection and substitute dialogue, and in the space that was created by focusing on something other than the fear, or whatever we want to call it, him, the guy, and all the feelings associated with it, you made space and peace could enter. And so you did it, you just didn't, you probably just attributed it to the book, to the words you were reading, but not the principles of the practice. Now you understand from practicing how it works. So you did have all that stuff at your disposal. You were always 100% capable of doing it. You just didn't have this class to give you techniques and for other people to, show you parallel examples and things like that. But what I find is every time I do that, every time I allow and I'm in space, I can remember, because my mind is quiet, I can remember a time where I felt similarly, and it was a brush with spirit. It was like you were getting brushes with spirit, because you didn't really know that you were allowing it by what you were doing. You kind of knew it because you kept doing it, right? So I get a lot of tangible, able to articulate what's happening awareness in hindsight, because I'm practicing. I've decided I'm going to practice no matter what, because I know the virtues of it, and I know that it feels better, and I know that it works because I've been practicing and I have a lot of momentum. And then sometimes I get feelings of things that have a familiar, they're familiar to me. And then I can recall, that's when a memory comes up. So that's exactly where we started the class, because Ernest was saying, I suggest that when you want to do that, you put yourself in a recollection of it. If you put yourself in the feeling that you had at the time, then you can recall the details much better. And that's exactly what happens to me now. And now I can articulate my experience better because I've had the experience. I've noticed that I've had it before, and maybe it was a brush with spirit. It was more coincidental. It was the lining up of things, not necessarily above consciousness. Now it's above consciousness that I do it. And then I have memories that I hadn't had before, and it's based on the feeling.
Yep.
Yes, right. So
Makes
I
sense.
agree with all that.
I also liked, Ida, that you used imagination, imagining yourself without fear. The imagination element is a powerful tool at our disposal. And if it's a tool, then I mean, how good is and how useful is a tool in your toolbox that you never pick up and use? That doesn't make
Like
any
you
sense.
said, I wouldn't suggest you imagine dragons. I imagine dragons all the time. I do. I
don't
imagine dragons
necessarily
when I'm
suggest.
doing yoga, when I'm doing Tai Chi. Dragons
Yeah.
come up. I have a bunch of dragons with me doing Tai Chi.
Well, I don't necessarily recommend. I'm sharing it, and if you want to, and if it resonates, then anybody can. But the dragons are adaptation for me, because what are they doing when you see dragons depicted, specifically Chinese versions where there's no like big wings? They're like worms, flying worms, and they're very adaptable and they coil around things. And so that's why I use dragons as my adaptation. Karen, were you going to say something? I saw you unmute for a second. Could have been accidental, and that's okay. But I would say, yeah, I think that's a pretty good discussion. We got into the root of fear and all of that. Yeah.
I also wanted to say there are plenty of movies, and there are plenty of creative endeavors that are not just only primarily trying to make money and feed
Well,
the
they're out there.
drama and
Yeah.
suck people in. Like, there are such great series out there that not necessarily end happily ever after, but I agree with Ida. I love when it starts with what appears to be a problem, a struggle, some kind of issue. There's disharmony, and that through the character development or whatever, it changes. And sometimes it's simply the lens of perception that changes. Some of the practices change after, you notice the practices of the people, but the lens of perception is shifted first, and then the behavior. I love that. There's a series, if you want a suggestion, called Atypical. I saw it a while ago. It's about a boy with autism. And in the beginning, it seems like a family life with a boy with autism, and how this people in school pick on him and stuff like that. And his sister is his defender, and just dynamics of that. And it seems like it's sad because he's mentally deficient in some way, or damaged in some way, or not normal in some way. And he's really not. He's just atypical. And that's just fine. and then it follows, he's the center character, and how everybody responds around him is the series. And over time, he learns to adapt. He's not subject to societal pulls as much as everybody else. He's not subject to the media. He does tend to fixate on some things, but he learns from them, and he applies what he learns from his love of penguins to how humans operate differently, and then the expectations of humans on his behavior. And he has feelings, and he has all those things. He sees it through a different lens. And so by the end of the story, you really get some wisdom from him through his adaptation of the way his brain works, and you're no longer looking at him as a character with this big deficit and how much better his life would be if he was like everybody else. As a matter of fact, there are things about the way his brain works that makes his ability to adapt superior. And so it's a wonderful story that way. And it doesn't, in the beginning, it seems like it's going to suck you in with the regular drama. And because they're talking about the common mind and how people react and how people respond. And that is true to life experience. But it really helps you look at the dynamics of the lens of perception. And I love that. I love when movies do that. Let's look at this differently, and then everything changes.
Mm-hmm. All right, noted. If anybody's looking for a series to watch,
it's not just it's not a movie, it's a series on Netflix.
A series. I don't have Netflix, but yeah, I'll check it out when I do, if I do. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good stopping point, perhaps. So dream walking is simply everything that we've ever been talking about, and sometimes you can get glimpses of it because for whatever reason today your practice seems easier, it feels easier. That's the feeling of dream walking, and I can go into why it feels that way and how I discovered it, but that would be a whole group study, and we can talk about that another time.
Is it actually walking in your dreams? Did I miss that?
That's where it came. That's where the feeling is where I was able to identify the feeling, because in a dream with lucidity, where you're aware of the dream, there's a type of ease almost with the world around you. A lot of it is because your mind isn't identifying it as real. So when you're lucid, keep in mind, if you're not lucid, then your body is having electrochemical, physiological, hormonal reactions to everything, and the nervous system doesn't know the difference, which is why you wake up before you die in a dream, is because your nervous system is shocked because it doesn't know the difference, and you wake up. So similarly, by being lucid in a dream, I could feel how everything was being held up by my perception and by my mind, how my mind was projecting what I felt I was perceiving. In my normal practice of the waking environment, there were times where I arrived there accidentally, of course, and then there are times where it's a result of the accumulated momentum of my practice, where it feels easier. There's less resistance. I am in what I call the sixth pillar. I am actively going with rather than against, and it just feels, easy. Easy. I'm putting that in air quotes. I don't want that to imply
my
that
mind immediately went to being the feeling of being in water, as opposed to you have less weight when you're in water, and so you move differently because it's lighter than you do when you get out of the water and you have more of the pull of gravity, the buoyancy of that's just what my brain went to when you were describing dream walking as being a place, as you're in a dream, therefore the effects of the reality state are not upon you, so it's easier, it's lighter.
It can be, yeah, for sure. And then so that's what I learned from dreams, and I took that feeling out of the dream and I put it into my everyday experience, and not every day is like that, of course. The other one that I've learned from visions, and I'll explain the difference between visions and dreams in my books. All of this gets a little bit not teachy, like this isn't teaching, this is just sharing creatively, but is the act of seeing. And that's when you're in your practice, and because you're in a place of peace and neutrality, you can see things from multiple perspectives and directions, and you can see it through multiple scopes of time and space, and it's hard to describe. Ida kind of got close to describing something pretty similar when she was talking about, seeing things from different perspectives. I would start to say that when we're doing that deliberately and intentionally, we're in an act of seeing. And seeing does involve your eyes, but it involves your body and everything else, because you're seeing feeling. So basically the seeing is when you bring your practice and the first three pillars and the second three pillars of feeling, and they start to overlap, if that makes sense. And so now you have a perspective of a different feeling of something, but also logically, visually, it could be different. Like it could be critical thinking. Critical thinking becomes easier with this practice as well. So those would be two things. Vision, from visions, I learned the act of seeing, which involves the sixth pillar, which is the act of going with, or the act of alignment. And then dream walking, which is everything that we've ever been talking about, but for either by accident or by virtue of practice and momentum, you are arriving at it easier today. And so you're still doing it though. Like, I don't want, it's not as if, oh, you drop out of the sky and I can't tell you where my mind was because I was dream walking. No, I have put my mind exactly where I want to put it. It's just, there's no real pull away from it, or there's not as much of the world isn't tugging on me as much. I'm walking through it like I was a dream. Does that make sense? Kind of, no? Okay. Exactly. Yeah. And one of the reasons, Ida, is because our society in general is sight dominant. I would venture to guess that we could feel our environment even more with other senses as well if we were more reliant or we interacted with those senses more. So eventually, I think that we can feel with our hearing and with every aspect of our sensory perception. And ultimately, my thesis with this practice is that we can feel only with the direction of our attention, the direction of our attention on a memory, for example. And then don't forget the fourth pillar, or the fifth pillar, excuse me, which is, it goes along with the fourth. They can actually happen almost overlapping, but to where now you're sensing into the moment and you're accumulating new things. Because you're notice that's always happening, by the way, but you can notice them separately. So you can notice memories, emotional memory, separate from the newness. You can do that if you want to, especially as a form of redirection if necessary. But when they start to occur a little bit more naturally, you'll notice them simultaneously. It'll be like, oh, I had this feeling back when I was, such and such age and such circumstances, but also there's this new feeling of, and that will typically be relevant to your current circumstances and conditions and things like that. So they start to kind of overlap. But you can also separate them if you want to. I could focus entirely on sensing into the newness of the moment. And that's not really emotional memory as much. It's like a slider again, or I can slide it more towards emotional memory, or I can be right in the middle where I got a little bit of both. And then when it all starts to feel a little bit easier, when I'm in that dream walking state, that's the sixth pillar, the act of allowing. When that pillar is active, we're not in a state of resistance. And I'm not going to sit here and say I'm always in that. That's not the case. But I keep redirecting back to these feelings and going back to my pillars of practice. So I find myself swimming in the sixth with all of my pillars active, more and more, I'll say. But I'm not going to create the image of perfection and say that I'm there all the time. That's just silly. Okay, well, I think that was a good group study. Tuesday, we'll go back to talking about the common errors. That was something that we didn't really get into as much, but the common errors of the practice through the lens of teacher training. And if I'm sure Donna has noticed, this isn't an organized teacher training. It's more what questions do you have? What do you need to know to feel more comfortable to share the information type of thing. But yeah. And then Thursday, group study. And I do have a 12 o'clock appointment available for mindful mentoring or Tai Chi this Sunday. So let me know and I can book it for you through the MindBody app, or you can go to the MindBody through Shenshen Health and Harmony website. Soon I'll link that to my own website. That does make sense. But if you wanted to do a one-on-one, it's donation based, so it can also be free if for whatever reason you don't have anything to donate right now. That's okay. I don't mind. So if you want a one-on-one, let me know because I have one spot available for Sunday. Okay. I will see you guys again on Tuesday if you can make it. Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday. If you sign up and want a one-on-one, I'll see you on Sunday. Okay. And the one-on-ones are just 45 minutes for those, by the way. All right. Well, I will see you guys all again soon, and reach out to me if you did want the 12 o'clock spot. Again, it can be free, or it could be $10, or it can be $1 million if you're feeling generous, whatever. All right. I will see you guys again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. Bye.